One of the least covered aspects of the fighting on the ground has been the military developments. What is going on the ground in Gaza? What have the Israelis really achieved? How close is the IDF to defeating Hamas? Prior to the ground invasion, there was a lot of conversation and speculation as to how the IDF, how the Israelis would approach the Gazan terrain. On an objective level, it is a difficult terrain to deal with. Not only is it very, very dense, but the streets are very, very tight, which favors mobile infantry, mobile warfare. And as we can imagine, the Israelis would be using heavy artillery. And we know, judging by recent histories, great powers have failed in guerrilla terrains. We have the case of Afghanistan with the Americans, and we also have the case of Vietnam. And with the case of Gaza, there is all of this, and also the fact that the Israelis would have to deal with an intricate 500-kilometer tunnel network which is underground. Released hostages like Yosef Lifshitz, the 85-year-old who had been kept in the network, described it as being a spiderweb. Without knowing for certain the layout of the tunnel network, Israel would only have to opt for the option of a ground invasion, but they would be faced with another difficulty. They would first have to find the network before attempting to destroy it. So a question arises, what was the Israeli strategy for the ground invasion? Of course, to a certain degree, we can only speculate, but in the last Israeli IDF ground incursion in 2014, the IDF made use of thinly armored M113s. They, though, were easily penetrated by rocket fire. 60 soldiers were reportedly killed, with hundreds more injured. The 50-year-old armored personnel carrier was heavily criticized at the time. Strategist and historian Edward Lutwerk wrote for Unheard that this time around, the Israelis were more likely to use a recent military project, a recently armored military unit, the 70-ton Namer. He thought that this stronger and more robust vehicle could be used to create de facto fortresses around the tunnels, allowing combat engineers to go about the task of destroying them. And so he mentions, after they reach the suspected tunnel sites, the Namers will line up to form a perimeter, an improvised fortress to protect the combat engineers as they go about their task. The problem is that from the very beginning of the October ground offensive, Arabic sources were actually reporting that the resistance rockets were destroying Israeli tanks. According to the resistance spokesman, in the 48 days before the truce deal, the Gazan fighters destroyed 335 Israeli armored vehicles. This sentiment has also been echoed in the English media, even though the Business Insider reported on the 5th of December that only 24 tanks have been destroyed by the resistance. Footage released from the battlefield actually shows resistance fighters hitting Israeli tanks from in between buildings. And as you can see, resistance fighters have actually recorded themselves planting IEDs onto tanks in order to disarm the missile defense trophy system. Another factor worth considering is the visual disparity between the costs of the weaponry being used. For example, the resistance have been primarily using a Gazan manufactured rocket called the Yasin 105, which is named after the founder of the movement, Sheikh Ahmed Yasin, who was killed by an Israeli airstrike in 2004. This weapon only costs an approximate $200 to manufacture, and it is destroying armored vehicles that cost about $3 million each. And the rockets which are being fired from Gaza into Israel cost approximately 100 times less than the interceptor missiles that the Israelis are using from the Iron Dome. The disparity in the cost of the weaponry being used means that from the Gazan side, the relatively inexpensive weapons being used need to be counterbalanced by immense spending from the Israeli side. And some may find this surprising, but some estimates have actually mentioned that the current war will cost the Israelis more than $50 billion. And essentially, this explains the Israeli reliance on American funding and support. And it also explains why aid bills currently going through the American Congress are so important. It seems that if the Americans withdraw their military support, then for the Israelis, it will become more and more difficult to sustain this war. As the Financial Times have reported, Netanyahu has been very, very clear about what he requires from the Americans. And I quote, munitions, munitions, munitions. Despite the intensity of the fighting, which is expected to increase as the fight moves down towards the south of Gaza, the official Israeli death toll still stands at 80 soldiers that have been killed. However, from the resistance's perspective, the Israelis are intentionally deflating the number of Israeli soldiers killed. A few days ago, the resistance reported that it was able to carry out an offensive on 60 Israeli soldiers. Though this report was initially denied, the resistance went on to release a video to the contrary. Before the truce, 2 Israeli generals were dismissed as their battalions fled during battle. And the resistance continues to release videos of intense battles happening on the ground in Gaza. Whatever the true death toll is, or whatever the nature of the fighting on the ground in Gaza is, what seems to be the case is that the battles on the ground in Gaza are intense and fierce. And the resistance retains enough control in the Gaza Strip to dictate negotiation terms, insisting that the military personnel that are being held in Gaza will only be released if there is a ceasefire and with the release of Palestinian prisoners from the hands of the Israelis. Though the bombing campaign means serious damage is being done to Palestinian infrastructure, it does not, however, translate to meaning controlling territory. The tunnel system in Gaza seems to mean that Israelis will continuously be flanked. For instance, despite claiming to occupy the north of Gaza, the resistance held a number of hostage releases in the north, as if to say that the Israelis were far from seizing control. The military reality is clearly far more complex than most media lets on. From the very beginning, the goal of Benjamin Netanyahu was, we need to destroy Hamas and release the hostages. Benjamin Netanyahu was only able to release the hostages by agreeing to a truce deal that was proposed by the resistance from the very beginning. On a military level, it seems that Israel is finding it incredibly difficult to actually destroy Hamas.